Okay, thank you. Thank Hendrik and the Buffett Center for inviting me out here to speak with you about energy politics in Latin America. Now, I don't know how much you know about energy in Latin America, and I don't know how much you know about energy, so I put together a presentation that I think will get at some of the very interesting issues that are coming up, but we'll start out with some basic issues that drive the politics in the region, but which you may not either be aware of or think are all that important, and I'm going to argue that they're very important. Okay. So two issues drive energy politics. One is the distribution of rents, and we're not just talking about the distribution of rents between countries and multinational corporations. That usually people talk about rent distribution issues, and that's what they talk about is a country and an international oil company. But in Latin America, the distribution of rents within Latin America are also very important. When Bolivia nationalized the gas industry again, the biggest company that was affected by that was Petrobras, which is the state-owned company of Brazil. Brazil led by the leftist president Lula. So, you know, this, if you're not aware of these kinds of things, it's really easy to fall into sort of our traditional thinking about this. The biggest private investors in Peru right now in the gas sector are Argentine private company. And then within Latin America, the distribution of rents is a major issue as well. Elite, poor, rural, urban. So we're going to talk a lot about rents, but we need to remember that it's not just international corporations and national governments in Latin America. The other issue that drives energy politics is the question of the role of the market. All right? And we're not just talking about the market for international exports or imports, this global market and its impact on Latin America. There are regional markets for energy in Latin America. Some of the players like Bolivia, their gas doesn't go into the international market. There really isn't an international market for natural gas. So the big markets for Bolivia are Argentina and Brazil. Potential market in Chile. So if we're thinking about Bolivian gas and we're thinking about the market, we're going to be thinking about Chile, Argentina, and Brazil and the conflicts that arise there. And then there's also the issue of the domestic market. The domestic market, both in terms of production and consumption. So just we have to remember these two big issues here, rents and markets. My argument is that a country is most likely to develop an energy sector, whether we're talking about an exporting sector or an importing sector, but an energy sector that can sustain national development when the political system is inclusive, political competition is balanced, and the energy market is overseen by an independent regulatory agent. So that's my argument. Now we're going to go through why I get to this point. All right, some key concepts. Ownership of these resources. All Latin American countries own the subsoil resources. Okay? This is true most countries around the world, but it's true in all Latin American countries. Why is this important? Because the resource belongs to the country. All right? Now, resource endowment, oftentimes we think of resource endowment as something that's natural, but it's natural only in an almost meaningless sense. A country's resource endowment really depends on investment. Okay? It takes investment to find the resource. You don't know if you have the resources. Okay? You know you have some resources, you start using those resources, you got to replace those resources. It takes investment to replace those resources. Reserves are usually are categorized in terms of proven, probable, and potential reserves. And you don't know how much you have until you start drilling. When Bolivia first discovered that it had a lot of natural gas, the figures being tossed around were 53 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's what Bolivia thought it had. As they started to drill, they discovered that, well, they really didn't have that much. And it really was, it's still a lot of gas, but it's significantly less gas than that 53 trillion cubic feet. So you really need to drill. Production depends on investment. Okay? Investment in technology and in human skills. One of the problems that Mexico has today is that it doesn't know how to drill in deep water. We suspect Mexico has lots of oil and gas in deep water, but given the Mexican system, only Pemex can drill for that deep water, those deep water wells. Mexico doesn't know how to do that. Petrobras knows how to do that, but Mexico doesn't. So that means that we suspect that the oil and gas are out there, but Mexico can't access it. All right, so investment in technology and human skills is important. And last word on investment is that investment capital is scarce and has opportunity costs. We oftentimes think of a country has a lot of oil and gas, therefore it will be able to attract the investment. No. There are different places you could put that investment, both internationally and nationally. One of the issues for Latin American countries that have national oil companies, even if they have a lot of resources, the government's not putting money into the national oil company so the national oil company can drill. They won't let anybody else drill, or they put terms that make it unattractive for other people to drill, private actors to drill, or other national oil companies. The government won't put it there because it's spending its money somewhere else. Right? So the end result is they're not producing. Rents. Rents, most of you probably know, rents means super profits, profits above the norm. In the natural gas area, the norm for profits is about 12 to 15%. The big issue with rents is the question of how you're going to distribute those rents. Rents are almost a natural byproduct of natural resources because it doesn't take a lot of money to produce a natural resource, but we don't know where the natural resources are, so you're going to invest money in there, and sometimes the wells will turn up dry. So it's a risky investment. It takes a lot of investment to come in, so that's a big issue. In Latin America, the oil fields, the cost of production for oil fields ranges from $1 a barrel to about $30 a barrel. Okay, so there's a huge range in what it costs to produce a barrel of oil in Latin American fields. That range has a huge impact when we start talking about the distribution of rents. When prices are volatile, that's also another major issue because contracts, given all of the issues associated with contracts are very difficult to draw up to deal with dramatic increases in price or dramatic decreases in price. I've given you an example here of a royalty payment. There are two basic ways in which countries try and appropriate the rents. That's through royalties and taxes. Here, if we have a 50% royalty, let's say cost of production is $15 a barrel. If the international price is $50, the royalty at 50% is $25, and the firm makes $10. Okay, it invests 15 in the production. It gets 25 minus the 15, so it gets 10. The international price rises to $100. The royalty is still 50%. Well, the company is now paying $50 in royalty, but it's now getting $35 instead of the $10. Okay? Now, why is this an issue? To go back to that starting point, because the resource belongs to the country. It doesn't belong to the company. It belongs to the country. So the question is, why should the company get this extra rent? That rent should go to the owner of the resource. Well, if you've got a royalty system set up on that 50%, you're losing that extra bit there. You can't go back in and renegotiate contracts every time the price fluctuates. So that raises an issue. One way in which you might be able to tap into that into those rents more is through a tax structure, a progressive tax structure. But what we know about tax structures is that the tax collector doesn't have the kind of information regarding costs that the producer has, and therefore you've got these information asymmetries between the producer and the tax collector, and that's going to mean that some rents are escaping out via that route. Taxes also affect which fields are used first. They're actually inefficient for getting the best fields to be used first. The other issue about appropriation is even if the government appropriates the rents that are associated with the national resource, you get the question of the representativeness of the public agents. Is the government appropriating these rents for the public goods that we would like the country to be able to develop, or is it appropriating it for private benefits associated with particular government agents, whether it's a politician who's lining his pockets or a government agency that has its particular project that it wants to promote, or a broad-based group in the government that nevertheless wants these rents to go into the projects for its constituency, but not for national projects. So these are the issues that come up associated with rents. The governance structure for the energy sector. The governance structure basically deals with two things. One is the regulator of the market. We're not talking here about a free market versus a non-free market. In all of these natural resource areas, there is a great danger that the actors in the market can generate rents at the cost of the consumer, so you need to have somebody in there looking out for the consumer, and this is the market regulator. The market regulator, the big issue there is whether that regulator will be independent or not. And when we talk about independent, we usually mean the independent from the government. All right? But it's not just an issue of whether it's independent from the government. It's an issue of whether that regulator is able to constrain both the government and the private sector. The government may have a national oil company. All of the big Latin American countries have national oil companies, oil and gas companies. The government wants to suck resources out of that national oil company, and it sucks too many resources out. The national oil company can't invest, the national oil company can't produce, et cetera, et cetera. So the regulator, the role of the regulator should be to protect that national oil company from this kind of rent appropriation by government agents. So it doesn't just regulate the government, it also regulates the private sector. If you have a private company working in the national energy markets, whether as a producer or as a supplier, the incentive for that company is to try and generate rents that it can appropriate. So the regulator is in there trying to ensure that those rents don't get created. The institutional restraints on the discretionary scope of the regulatory agent are fundamental, because once you've empowered an agent to come out and regulate the government and the private sector, the question, it's a principal agent problem, right? The question is, so what's going to keep this agent from using that power in order to appropriate those rents for its own purposes? And this is where the institutional restraints on that regulator come into play. So you need, the best situation is to have an independent regulator, but an independent regulator who has to abide by certain rules about what it means to regulate a market. All right. The regulatory incentive structure influences pricing, subsidies, competition, etc. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. All right, now to the big issues that most of the time we hear when we talk about energy issues in Latin America. Resource nationalism. What does this concept, resource nationalism, mean? Well, essentially what it means is that the government, because whenever we talk about resource nationalism, we're talking about the government. Okay, the government wants to maximize its appropriation of the rents. Okay? It is its resource, the national resource. The government wants to maximize that rent appropriation, and it's always put in terms of we want to maximize this rent appropriation for the benefit of national development. All right, governments never talk about this is for the benefit of my political party or my constituency. It's always in terms of the national development. So we should conceive of resource nationalism in those terms. The means of trying to appropriate these rents, maximize the rent appropriation, are by the government setting the terms for exploration, production, transportation, and distribution of energy. All of these are part of the process of producing something and getting it to the final consumer. Whenever you have a policy of resource nationalism, the government is aware that rents are being generated at each stage of this process, and the government is trying to appropriate those rents to the maximum. Okay. Energy security is usually something that we think about in terms of a country that is importing energy, but I don't think that's the best way to think about it. I think we should think about resource nationalism and energy security is simply governments trying to intervene in markets. Okay. In the case of resource nationalism, the government is trying to intervene in order to maximize rents, but in energy security, the government is trying to intervene in order to insulate national economic activity from shortages or dramatic price increases. The means of doing this is government regulation of national energy markets via subordination of other policy goals to a more aggressive pursuit of domestic supplies, price controls, and trade restrictions. We'll see this over and over again in Latin America. Argentina has contracts to send natural gas to Chile. There's an economic crisis in Argentina. The government tries to appropriate rents through resource nationalism on private companies producing natural gas in Argentina. So the companies don't produce as much natural gas. You now get a shortage in the domestic market in Argentina. Now, in the name of energy security, Argentina says, well, we're not going to permit the export of this natural gas to Chile. Okay, so there you've got both energy, resource nationalism and energy security at play. I put not just rhetoric up at the top, because I'm really interested in the policy that's adopted and not just the rhetoric. The United States has a rhetoric of energy security, but we don't do anything in order to promote energy security. Okay? We don't put an excess profits tax on the oil companies. We don't drill in areas where we didn't drill before. We don't change our policy. We have a rhetorical policy about it. All right. So I'm not interested in the rhetoric. I'm interested in the actual policies. Government intervention and market adjustment options. Resource nationalism and energy security can be actively pursued by importers and exporters of energy. One of the nice things about Latin America is the variation that we have in Latin America on these schemes. You have countries that have resource nationalism with very little energy security. Contemporary Mexico today is a prime example of this. Mexico does not subsidize gasoline prices very much. At certain points in time, depending on what's happening in the market, there's no subsidy to gasoline. Venezuela subsidized gasoline huge. I think it's about 17 cents a gallon for gasoline in Venezuela. So in Mexico, you've got resource nationalism because in Mexico, the national oil company has a monopoly. Okay? No other country in Latin America is still in this position. Okay, in Mexico still has that, all right? They're trying to change that, very small changes here and there, but it's all got to be done through Pemex because Pemex has that monopoly. So Mexico would score high on resource nationalism, but relatively low on energy security. Countries that had high on resource nationalism and high on energy security. Brazil at one point, from 1953 to 1997, Petrobras had a monopoly. It was both a monopoly in the name of resource nationalism. We have a little bit of natural resources. They're going to be produced and appropriated by the state for the good of national development. But we're an energy importer, so we're concerned about energy security, and therefore Petrobras has to be involved in the domestic market, regulating the pipelines, regulating the gas stations, et cetera, et cetera. So from 53 to 97, when they made a change in 97, Argentina, after the 2001 crisis, is a case of resource nationalism with energy security. Energy security with little resource nationalism, basically Central American countries up to the mid-1980s before they moved into the direction of market liberalization. Market adjustment as an alternative to resource nationalism and energy security, examples there would be Argentina under Menem, contemporary Chile, and Colombia. Now, what we've got here is lots of variation. All right, over time and across countries, which is really wonderful when you're doing analyses because, you know, it allows you to hold some things stable, but it really forces you to try and explain these changes over time. Let me point out that here on the bottom, contemporary Chile and Colombia and Argentina. Argentina privatized everything in the energy sector under Menem, but Colombia has not privatized everything. There's still a national oil company in Colombia. It competes. I'd put Brazil down here to some degree. So market adjustment doesn't mean that everything gets privatized. Okay? Market adjustment can happen when you have a national oil company, and that national oil company has to be competitive. Okay? One of the big examples of a successful state-owned enterprise national oil company is Norway's Statoil. It is on various measures of efficiencies of energy companies, private or public. Statoil, state-owned corporation in Norway, scores higher than the major private international oil companies. Okay, so it's not a case of if it's government, it's inefficient. If it's private, it's efficient. All right, it varies. Why does it matter? Some people look at the energy area and assume that, well, when prices are high, all exporters are going to do well. Okay? But that doesn't turn out to be the case. Some exporters can't produce even to their OPEC quotas and see their capacity decline. Venezuela, under Chavez, is very much in this situation. Despite what the official claims in Venezuela are about how much it's producing, you tap into the markets and the information is coming from the markets, and Venezuela's production has fallen dramatically. Even OPEC says Venezuela is not producing to its OPEC quota. It's producing below its OPEC quota. Why is it producing below its OPEC quota? Because PDVSA, the national oil company, doesn't have the capacity to produce anymore. Okay, it's been starved of resources, both human capital and investment capital, so it can't produce anymore. So PDVSA's capacity has declined. Or you have an exporter like Mexico. It's not a member of OPEC. It's a price taker in that sense. I mean, Venezuela is a huge player in OPEC, so it's going to have an impact on prices through its influence over OPEC. Mexico doesn't have an influence on international prices, so it's a price taker. But Mexico can't even maximize its situation as a price taker because it's not producing what it should be producing. Okay, so exporters, prices are high, they're not doing as well as they should be doing. Okay, do all importers have trouble adjusting when prices are high? Again, not the case. Some importers have trouble adjusting. Argentina, after 2004, Argentina started suffering from energy shortages. Cases in the winter where you couldn't get that natural gas to heat homes, etc. So those were real shocks. In 2004, Argentina stops exporting, meeting its contract to Chile because it's having these problems at home. Chile was importing the energy from Argentina, but Chile doesn't suffer as much as Argentina suffers. Okay? Chile didn't go through those kinds of shortages, so Chile is able to adjust better than Argentina is to the situation of high prices. Brazil, from 2004 to 2006, Brazil adjusts well to high energy prices. The prices start to go up in 2004. I don't have Brazil there today because Brazil is no longer an energy exporter. It's a small importer, sorry. It's no longer an energy importer. It's a small energy exporter. And its energy exports will be growing in the future. If you think about Brazil, 20 years ago, Brazil looked like a case that had a country that had no natural resources, natural resources. And what happened was there were changes in legislation in '97 that made it more attractive for both Petrobras and private companies to explore for energy in Brazil, and they have found a lot of energy in Brazil. Okay, so Brazil is now in a situation where it's got huge fields of both oil and gas, and we're not talking about just what's called the pre-salt layer that is very far down. It's going to take 15, 20 years for those fields to come online. It's going to be a lot of investment. Brazil actually has fields that it's tapping into now that allow it to be. In 2006, it reached energy sufficiency, and now it's a small exporter. Okay. Why does it matter too? When prices are low, all exporters have trouble adjusting. Not the case. Energy prices were real low in the 1990s. The floor fell out. Bolivia did quite well in the later 1990s. Mexico did quite well in the 1990s. When prices are low, do all importers do well? No, not the case again. In the late 80s, early 90s, Peru and Brazil were having real problems, even though they were energy importers and the prices were low. Okay, so these two slides just make the case that we can't look to international markets to simply assume we'll know what's going on in national markets. All right? When the prices are high, not all exporters are benefiting. When the prices are low, not all importers are benefiting. So what does that say? It says that politics matters. So we really have to look at the politics associated with energy policies. This table just, is a visual of the situation I just described. The solid blue lines are people who are countries that improved their energy situation, and the dotted lines are countries that suffered a decrease. On the x-axis, you've got the ability of the energy sector to support national development. Let me say a word about that there. What I mean by national development is not what I, as an analyst, say should be the national development of this country. What I'm looking at is the way in which the government has articulated its national development strategy. Okay, so that's what I'm interested in. You've said you want to implement this national development strategy. You need energy in order to do that. Okay, so let's look at your energy policy and see, is it successful for supporting that national development strategy? If we start with Argentina there, you'll see on the y-axis we got market intervention. In 1995, Argentina is very low on market intervention because it's privatized everything under Menem. And it's very high, it scores very high on the ability of the energy sector to support national development because it is producing a lot of natural gas. It had been importing natural gas from Bolivia. It freed up the market. They discovered a lot of natural gas, enough natural gas to supply the Argentine market and to export. So in the 1990s, Argentina is exporting natural gas to Brazil, to Uruguay, and by the end of the 1990s, it'll also be exporting natural gas to Chile. So it's got a lot of natural gas. So it scores Low on market intervention, high on the ability of the sector to support national development. This makes it the darling of the multilateral banks, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. Think Argentina has really hit on the solution here. But it turns out not to be a very good solution for a variety of reasons, and it falls in its on the x-axis. It falls rather dramatically as it moves towards market intervention. Not just because it moves into the markets, but you've got to move towards market intervention and decline there. Look at Chile. Chile also declines. 2000, Chile is very high on ability of the energy sector to support national development. Why? It's importing its energy. Okay? Yes, it's importing its energy, but not a big deal. It can afford to import energy and drive the national economy. That's the issue. Can you afford the energy to drive your national economy? And Chile is importing this energy from Argentina. They tried to import it from Bolivia, and Bolivia said no. Okay, so they turned to Argentina, and they're importing it from Argentina. They're very low on market intervention. By 2008, they're still very low on market intervention. They're still doing all right on the ability of the energy sector to support national development, but not as well as they were doing in 2000. Why? Because Argentina has cut the flow of gas to Chile. So now they've got to pump more out of their economy to pay for that energy. So that's going to have a negative impact on their national development. Right? You can see down here, I have where you are on this chart is a function of your resource endowments, policy characteristics, domestic market conditions, and international market conditions. So it doesn't just depend on what you do. Okay? These countries can't control energy prices, right? So they're going to respond to that. But what you do influences how well you're responding to that. Okay? These are not entirely independent. Policy characteristics will influence your resource endowments. Okay? It's the point I made earlier. Countries have natural resources, but we don't know if they actually have them until we start exploring. Okay? What does it mean to explore? It means to invest capital. So Argentina in the 70s is importing all of this natural gas from Bolivia because they don't think they have energy. They don't think they have natural gas. They open up the market. In the late 70s, early 80s, they discovered a lot of natural gas. So now they don't need to import that energy from Bolivia. They're producing it themselves. In 2000, or after 2001, when Argentina regulates the market, they're using up their known natural gas reserves. They're not discovering new natural gas reserves because there's no incentive for anybody to invest and look. It's not a case of private versus public. Bolivia is experiencing the same problem today. Bolivian natural gas reserves are declining. Okay, even though they have a national oil and gas company, YPFB. YPFB is not exploring. Why is YPFB not exploring? Because it doesn't have the capital to explore. Because the government doesn't put capital into the national oil company. It wants to appropriate that capital and put it into other things. So Bolivia is in a situation where it's not able to meet its contracts to Argentina. Okay? It's meeting its contracts to Brazil, but it can't meet its contracts to Argentina. So where you are on this chart, or this figure, is a function of some natural things and lots of policy. Okay, and then the fact that there is a market for, in the case of petroleum, is an international market. In the case of natural gas, there isn't an international market for natural gas, but there are contract situations. You can go and sign a long-term contract for LNG, liquefied natural gas. The reason we say there's not an international market for it is once you sign that long-term contract for that natural gas, most of those contracts have what are called pay or take contracts. You have to take that natural gas or you pay for it. Okay? Once it's coming to you, you can't easily sell it to somebody else because nobody has subcontracted to you. You can't put it in a spot market. There isn't a spot market for natural gas the way there is for petroleum. So the markets matter in natural gas in a different way than they do for petroleum. So there, what I basically wanted to show was that there is a lot of variation. It's not a case of if you intervene in the market, you're good or you're bad, okay? Or that over time, it really depends. Okay.
Can you say
Yes.
a couple words about Colombia and Peru?
Sure.
How they changed?
Sure. Colombia in up to 2000, Peru up to 1993 were sort of typical Latin American import substitution industrialization type national development programs. Colombia changed a little bit earlier, but their energy sector lagged behind that. So what you had really were national monopolies in the energy sector. It's not just that they have national oil companies, but everything has to go through the national oil company. In the case of Colombia, if you explored in Colombia and you found oil, so they're a little more open than Mexico, automatically Ecopetrol, the national oil company of Colombia, automatically was a 50% participant in your field. Okay? Even though they put nothing into exploration. Okay, automatically the company lost 50%. Okay, in 2000, Colombia recognized that it was having a problem. People weren't exploring. If people aren't exploring, you're not discovering the new fields. You're not discovering the new fields. You know you have fields, but you're using up the oil in those fields and natural gas in those fields. So in 2000, the Colombian government, change in government, Uribe comes in. The Colombian government decides to begin to change the regulations in the energy area. First, they make Ecopetrol's share drop to 30%. They do that in 2000, and then by 2003, there is no requirement that Ecopetrol become a shareholder in that field.
So the change must have begun under Pastrana.
Oh, yes. Okay, right. You're right. This is 2009. Yes, right. So the change begins under Pastrana. Right. One of the reasons why Colombia changes there is, remember we talked about opportunity cost of capital. When Ecopetrol is 50% of the partner of that oil field, the new investments to get that oil field to produce to its capacity, well, if you own 50%, you're supposed to be putting 50% of that new investment in, okay? And the Colombian government either didn't have or didn't want to put, depends on how you classify it, but didn't want to put that money into Ecopetrol. And so they were in a situation that Chavez finds himself in, where you've told the private companies that they have to let the state participate in the rents associated with this production, but we're not going to put any money into it. Venezuela has resource endowments that we know exist, so it's easier for Venezuela, not entirely easy, but it's easier for Venezuela than it is for Colombia to convince companies to go ahead and produce in these fields, even if the state company is not putting more money in. So they will produce for their share. They won't overproduce. Colombia has very little oil and natural gas, so it was difficult for Colombia to make that bargain with private companies. So they changed that. Peru had a similar kind of change in '93 under Fujimori.
David, I don't know if we're allowed to ask questions. I want to throw you too far off track, but now that we have this slide up, I wonder if I could ask you. So it seems, if I read this correctly, everybody who gets into market intervention basically gets penalized, right? I mean, their ability to actually support national government goes down.
Well,
the traditional obsolescing bargain story where
no.
Venezuela gets penalized, multinationals don't like what you're doing.
Yeah.
What's happening?
No, that's why I put Venezuela 2004. It says select countries and dates, all right? I've got 2008 there because we're in 2008, all right? The prices have gone down. But look at Venezuela up there, 2004. High prices, all right? This is why it's a function not just of what you do, but also what's going on in the international markets and your resource endowments. Venezuela is sort of the Saudi Arabia. It's got a lot of oil. All right, so whether or not Venezuela is favorable to your coming in, you want to be in there. ExxonMobil leaves.
Saudi Arabia with populist politics.
Yeah, but whether it has populist politics or not, most companies want to be in Venezuela. Okay, internationally, countries control those reserves. Okay, so there's very little private reserves out there. ExxonMobil is in an entirely different situation because for reasons that I haven't read yet why, and I don't study the company ExxonMobil, but what I know is they have a lot of reserves under their control. Okay, that makes them a different kind of oil company. No other oil company has those reserves under company control. All the other oil companies have to deal with national governments for access to those reserves. So when Chavez tells ExxonMobil, look, you have to invest more. Okay, we're taking more rents from you, and you have to put more new money in here. ExxonMobil says, forget it. I'm not going to put more money in here. The more money I put in here, the more money I've got captive in this market, and the more money you're going to take. I know you're going to keep appropriating more rents, and I don't need you. I can go somewhere else. So it leaves. Chevron can't leave. Total can't leave. Petrobras can't leave. They stay. The Chinese can't leave. They stay. Why? Because Venezuela has that much oil. All right. Now, they stay and they're not putting new money in. So now what we've got, the situation we have now in Venezuela is Chavez is once again threatening the companies because he wants the companies not just to stay there and pump. You've got sunk investments in here, so as long as you're covering your costs, it makes sense to keep pumping. But what Chavez wants is these companies to explore new areas and increase production. He wants that because PDVSA can't do it. So if the private companies don't do it, let me go down a couple of slides here and I'll show you. Oops, I want to show you that. Come on. All right. Venezuela production, all right, and fuel consumption. This is what's happened in Venezuela. That dark line is Venezuela's production. You can see it has fallen dramatically. All right. And it's fallen dramatically because PDVSA has no money and it has no skilled personnel. There was a big strike in 2003. The company basically was opposed to Chavez intervening in the company.
It's a lockout.
The company initially did this for the company's own purposes. Since there's a lot of opposition at that time to Chavez, the opposition to Chavez jumps on the company's opposition to the government stripping resources from the company. All right. So it's not that the company personnel was against Chavez. They were against the government intervening in the oil company. And it merged with the opposition to Chavez. But Chavez wound up firing over half of the skilled personnel in the company. Okay. Now this isn't the kind of operation where you can just, take somebody off the street and put them there and have them run the operation. So PDVSA's ability to produce fell dramatically. Now it didn't matter to Chavez when prices were going up. Okay? He's lost, or you could think about the loss that he would have made more money if PDVSA had been able to produce more oil, at least up to its OPEC quota. So he lost that money, but it didn't matter to him because the prices were going sky high. So PDVSA can't produce, the private companies are in there, and the private companies are producing because they've already sunk their investments in. If they stop producing, they've got their contracts to supply outside of Venezuela. They're not going to be able to meet those contracts. They're vertically integrated. They don't just want the petroleum, they want to refine that petroleum, they want to produce these other things. So it's in their interest for their fields to continue to produce. So if we were to split this dark line into PDVSA production and private company production, you would see private company production is pretty stable over that period. It's PDVSA production that's declined. In the current situation, Chavez wants the private sector to increase their production because the prices have fallen. The private sector doesn't want to increase their production because that would mean not producing more from the wells that they've got. They're producing from those wells. It would mean setting up new wells, drilling in new areas, and that means more new investment. And they don't want to put new investment into Venezuela at this point, given the international market conditions. The other problem for Chavez is the light line there. And this goes to the national development plans. That light line is domestic fuel consumption. Right? Now, we can all look at Venezuela at the end of the 90s and say the Venezuelan people, like the Bolivian people at the time, are getting screwed. Okay? They're getting screwed. This is a poor country. It's got a lot of natural resources. Even though the price is down, they have a lot of these resources. They could generate more money with it, and most of the people are getting screwed. All right? So both Morales and Chavez come in and they say, we want to appropriate these rents and invest them in national development so our people, and I say our people because it's their perspective, it's not their constituency pressuring them to do particular things. We'll talk about that later. But they want these rents to be used for the benefit of what they see as our people. Chavez considers fuel consumption to be a place where those rents should go. So the reason why in 2004 the price of gasoline in Venezuela is 11 cents and I think today it's 17 cents is because Chavez is essentially subsidizing those gasoline prices so that people in Venezuela can drive around in cars with cheap gasoline. They've bought the automobile stock has been replaced by a huge percentage, like 50% in the last 4 years. So they're buying lots of automobiles and they're driving with this price of gasoline that is subsidized by it. So that fuel consumption goes up dramatically. What does that mean? It means that Venezuelan exports fall dramatically. Okay. The black bar is what the Chavez government says they're exporting. Nobody believes it. All right. What the international markets and the international agencies are saying Venezuela is exporting is the gray line, the gray bar there, and you can see that it's down dramatically. If you take into consideration that all of that private production is for export, it's not for the domestic market, you can again see just how bad PDVSA is right now, because of that 1.7 million barrels, over half of that is coming from the private sector. Okay. What does that mean? It means that as prices go down and your volume exporting goes down, you're getting a double whammy. Okay, you're getting the whammy from the decline in prices, and you're getting the whammy from the decline in volume. You could make up the decline in prices by increasing your volume. Okay, given that Chavez is producing below his OPEC quota, he could still increase his production without undercutting OPEC. Okay, people cheat on their OPEC quotas at times. He could cheat a little bit, but even without cheating, he could still make more money. But he's not going to be able to do it because PDVSA doesn't have the capacity to produce. Okay, so we go back to that. chart. Yeah. So Hendrik, yeah. To answer your question, it's not the case that if you're in market intervention, you're in a bad situation. You know, it depends partly on what's going on in the markets. Okay, it depends partly on what's going on with your own resource endowment. You'll notice Venezuela isn't in as bad a situation as Argentina. Okay, why not? Because Venezuela's got all this natural resource endowment that we know they have. Yes.
But if you're in low market intervention, are you in a good situation, or at least a reasonably good one?
Reasonably good. All right, reasonably good. I was trying to find a country that's low market intervention right now and that's having a real problem, not a real problem with their national development, but a real problem with their national development because of their energy costs. Okay, and the best I could do is, you know, Chile certainly is not doing as well as they would like. You know, so they have certainly fallen, but you're better off.
Because they don't have those energy resources.
Right. But, you know, countries with those resources do worse, and other countries without those resources do worse. You know, I mean, you know, it's going to have an impact. That's why it's a function of not only your policy characteristics. Market intervention is your policy characteristics. It's also a function of resource endowments and domestic market conditions and international market conditions. You know, and they're not independent of each other entirely.
Does your variable, which is resource nationalization, ultimately mean a short-term approach to development? That is it not a tendency among Latin American countries to try to maximize short-term development at long-term cost?
When we get into my explanation, we'll see that. And it's not just a case of resource nationalism, because I make the argument that the same dynamics are driving energy security. All right. The issue, as Jim pointed out, well, Jim and Hendrik, I think, you know, the issue is really going to revolve around the type of market intervention that you have. Okay. So how can we explain the variation in how countries are doing in terms of the ability of their energy sector to be adequate to their national development plans? Here are four kinds of arguments that people have used. One is the resource endowment, the resource curse. All right. I won't spend time talking about that because I think Michael Ross's article 2001 is the best thing written about it. So why should I go over it again? And we have short time, and I want to get to other things. All right. So the resource curse just isn't adequate for explaining that variation. All right. Some countries with a lot of resources do well. Some countries with no resources do well. Some countries with a lot of resources do poorly. Some countries with a lot of resources do well. So it's not the curse. For the World Bank and the IDB, you know, it's a question of whether you have free markets or not. Well, again, the variations there, it's not a matter of whether the markets are free. Argentina was a darling in the 1990s because they freed up all their markets. What the World Bank and the IDB are coming around to is you got to have a credible market regulator in addition to privatizing, all right? And in fact, the IDB is now coming around to saying, well, having a national oil company isn't so bad if you have a credible market regulator, because the market regulator will make your national oil company compete. Okay, party competition, democracy. A lot of people, it's a case of, you know, whether you've got democracy in your country. You know, we can think of national development and an appropriate energy strategy as public goods. And, you know, public goods are more likely to be supplied in a democracy than without. I'm going to show you some reasons why I don't think that is appropriate. An example there that we could come up use very easily is Bolivia in the 1990s. It's a democracy. Under Sanchez de Lozada, Goni, they did a lot of things that from the outside looked like They were very progressive. Not only did they liberalize the energy sector and therefore draw in a lot of investment and therefore find a lot of natural gas and therefore have the opportunity to export this natural gas and therefore generate rents that it could use for national development. Goni's vice president was an indigenous intellectual. So is this incorporation of indigenous peoples into his administration? Goni promoted the decentralization of the national government. He set up regulations where shares of the national budget went directly to municipios. They skipped over state governments and went right to municipios, and he did this because he said national, the federal national system is appropriating all of this for their own purposes and the people aren't getting things. So from lots of perspectives, democracy in Bolivia in 1990 was now delivering all of these things. But what we learned in 2000 and 2001 and with the riots of 2003 that in which Goni in his second term had to leave office, was that Goni really wasn't interested in the people themselves actually being empowered. He had an indigenous person as a vice president, but when he came up with his indigenous rights, his way of incorporating indigenous peoples into the Constitution and the laws, it was, this is the way I want it done. Okay? It wasn't asking indigenous people for their opinion about, is this a good idea? No, this is me, Goni, and my group of advisors. We've decided that we're going to change the laws to incorporate indigenous interests in the following ways. Decentralization, the same thing. He decentralized, he said, here's the money, I'm giving you this money from the national government. By law, you get a percentage of the national budget. It goes to you. And then when the people in Cochabamba decided they wanted to use that money to set up a local water group, Banzer and Goni both said, well, no, you can't use the money for that. All right? No, we've said you've got to privatize the water. You can't use the money for that. And they said, well, we want to have a competitive firm, public firm that will be able to. They said no. And they even called out the police power of the state in order to ensure that the local people can't do that. So, it is, I'm not going to say Bolivia was not a democratic country in the 90s, all right? But it's not a simple case of whether it's democracy. We're really talking about whether people are empowered to be real actors in that democracy. And then the class-ethnic struggle for a lot of people, the issue is if the poor and the indigenous are shut out, you're not going to have a national development strategy that really delivers public goods or an energy policy that supports that. I don't think that's the case because, if we think about Venezuela today or even Bolivia, the poor and the indigenous aren't shut out. They're part of the government that's there, but nevertheless, both countries have awful energy policies. Bolivia is in the process of losing its markets. Even if they find more natural gas, they're not going to have anybody sell that natural gas to, because since they've been unreliable and since they have pushed against Petrobras, Brazil doesn't want to deal with them. So Brazil is not only exploring for its own natural gas, but Brazil is building LNG plants to import LNG at a slightly higher price than they could get from Bolivia, but with credible supply. Argentina is doing the same thing. Okay, so I wouldn't say that we explain the variation by whether the poor or the indigenous are in or out. Here's what my hypothesis is. That it's really these three factors that determine what you wind up getting in your energy strategy, your energy policy. One is the representativeness of those who govern. What I mean here is the inclusion or not of lower socioeconomic groups. The level of competition within the political system. Question there is, are the different political forces evenly balanced in terms of achieving control over policy making or not? And then the third factor is the institution of the market regulator, whether that market regulator is independent from the politicians. Let me go through each one of those and justify why I think they're an important variable, and then I'll give you an example at the end of how they work together. Then we can open up to questions. The inclusiveness of the political system. Political systems that exclude significant portions of their politically active groups will be unstable. If the political systems are unstable, their policies are going to be unstable. All right? Now, in the contemporary era, the poor and the indigenous have been empowered. Okay? We see this by the riots in the streets. They're not taking it anymore. Okay? And this means that even Chavez and Morales have to pay attention to them. They can't operate simply as a patron-client situation. They have to pay attention to what, in fact, people are saying about what the governments governing in their name are actually doing. So in the contemporary era, the poor and the indigenous have been empowered and demand participation as independent actors, not just as symbolic beneficiaries. There we have the example that I gave earlier of Sanchez de Lozada in Bolivia. Competition. Okay, not just in a democracy and with parties. If you're familiar with Barbara Geddes' argument, you'll see this is very much like Barbara's argument, except that I'm not limiting it to what happens in a democracy. All right? Barbara is very concerned about the politics in a democracy. In Latin America, we've shifted in and out of democracy, and we may be shifting again, in certain instances, away from democracy, any meaningful democracy. So I'm interested in competition within non-democratic governments as well. So non-democratic governments contain political cleavages within themselves. They're not unitary governments. So the dynamics of politics within a non-democratic government will also be important. The discretionary scope of the government is more likely to be limited if there is competition within the political forces behind that government. Why? For the argument that Barbara makes about democracies, but I would make the same thing when we're talking about military governments, and the Air Force and the Navy are concerned about what, in fact, the government's going to do. Okay, since you can't count on controlling the government for a long period, if you could control the government for a long period, you use the discretionary scope to benefit yourself and your constituency. But if there's competition within that government for control of these resources, you're better off trying to get that discretion to be limited so that you don't lose out when you don't have access. All right. Now, I do agree that a broader-based national development is more likely to be pursued when you have competitive democracies. Okay, so in that sense, I do believe with Barbara, but I do think that we will see authoritarian governments that actually wind up adopting energy strategies that fit very well the needs of their national development strategy. And my hypothesis would be is that what we're seeing there is this competition among political forces that support that authoritarian government, and that's what keeps the authoritarian government from simply appropriating those rents for what that government might want to do in a particularistic way. The third variable is this market regulator. The role of the market regulator is to oversee the functioning of the market. There are variations in this market regulator. If there is no regulator, what the World Bank learned is that private companies will try and rent seek. Okay, so if there is no regulator, private and public try to increase rents at a cost to each other and at a cost to the consumer. Okay, and that's going to undermine the national development strategy. If the regulator is administratively weak, what do I mean by administratively weak? I mean we've got a regulator on the books, but everybody knows that the regulators, the people named to the regulating agency are named there by the political parties. They split it up. You get half, I get half, or the president puts his cronies in, or the judiciary system won't back up the regulator when a conflict arises. That's what makes a regulator administratively weak. So it wouldn't be able to judge the information and make informed decision, wouldn't be able to implement the decisions. If the regulator is independent and capable, what we should see is a regulator constraining both private and public efforts to rent seek. Okay, so how does this all come together? Here's an example of the interaction among the three variables and why you need all three. Okay, so my argument when we looked at those four individual explanations, resource curves, competition, democracy, all of that, my argument wasn't that they don't hit on some of what matters. My argument is that really you need to look at the interaction among a number of different variables here. If a group does not feel represented, it's not going to have confidence that the rents that are natural in the natural resource area, that the rents will be distributed among private and public actors for the benefit of national development. It's not represented there, so it doesn't feel its interests are going to be articulated, and therefore couldn't possibly be for the benefit of national development. It has to be for the benefit of the people who exclude me from participating. All right, so what that means is that these excluded groups wouldn't support the government's energy policy, whether that government had a market regulator or not. This is the case, I think, again, of Bolivia in the 1990s. They had a market regulator. What Goni did was turn the national oil company from a producer into a regulator. But the indigenous people didn't feel represented by Goni's government. So it was not a policy that they would support, and when the time came, they rioted in the streets against that policy. Okay? If you are represented and you have a monopoly, you don't want the market regulator to keep you from appropriating all the rents for your specific project. You're now in control of government. So why not use those rents for the things that you didn't get before? I think this would be an example of Chavez, okay, and Chavez group there. All right, Chavez says we need to use these rents in order to have health clinics, in order to have schools, in order to have all of these other things. All right, but there is no long-term policy for how you turn that into benefits and how you keep the goose that lays the golden egg producing these rents. So the result has been, yes, everybody in Venezuela that Venezuela now represents says this is great. We're able to appropriate these rents, but PDVSA is being destroyed. If you are representative and if you are represented in the government and you don't have a monopoly, you want the market regulator to keep competitors from appropriating all the benefits when they're in office. So this is what leads you, very much along the lines of Barbara's argument, all right? This is what leads you to generate those public goods, okay? But again, let me emphasize, the difference with Barbara is I think it's not just whether the parties are balanced. The parties are balanced, but you've got these politically active groups in society that don't feel represented by those parties in a meaningful way. It's not going to matter that the parties are balanced. Those are not going to be stable policies. All right, so in a nutshell, that's my argument for why we're getting these variations, some countries doing well, some countries not doing well. It's a hypothesis. I'm just starting this project, so this is what I want to, once I get into the country details, what I want to explore. Yes?
I certainly would agree that if you have a monopolization of power, there is nothing to constrain irrational use of resources.
Well, I wouldn't call them irrational use.
Or self-fulfilling use of natural resources. That is, from a development point of view, a waste of natural resources. Let me raise a question. I'm not sure that it's a serious problem, but are there not liabilities in competitive
Henry, can I
policy
get a piece of paper?
in this sense that in a case of competitive politics, may you not have more variation and less consistency in policy? And is that a liability?
That's a good question. I would argue that you're more likely to get with competition, all right, parties coming in and out of power, you're actually more likely to get if those parties represent a broad spectrum of society, you're more likely to get a policy that's actually going to be delivering.
Yeah, though they may be representing different parts of the spectrum.
Right, but here, you know, again, I have to you know, footnote Barbara on this. I mean, I really do believe her argument. I think it's a great argument that if you know that you're going to be in and out of power, all right, you find it to be in your interest. Yeah, you find it to be, well, the constraint isn't that you can't do what you want, but you find it to be in your interest that you have public goods provided over a period of time, as opposed to, well, I'm in power for these 4 years, so I'm going to get everything for me. Now I'm out of power for the next 4 years, so I get nothing because you get everything. Well, that doesn't work really well. All right, so if I think I'm going to be in and out, right, it makes more sense for me to be thinking about, well, what's going to sustain the national development from which I benefit? Okay? And one of the reasons why I disagree with Barbara about is this enough is the Venezuelan example when the parties were in power. Okay, when AD and Copé were in power, by the end they're not representing very many people except AD and Copé. So they are looking for what will benefit the parties. And what's benefiting the parties continues to be the patronage associated with government, not national development. So,
although not completely representative, they were competitive.
Right, but that's why I say I disagree with Barbara on this point, because Barbara would say, well, they were competitive, so therefore what we should have seen was the provision of public goods. Okay, and I think in the energy sector what we saw were competitive parties, but in the energy case, no provision of public goods. Okay, because they didn't represent a broad spectrum. Barbara's assuming that in a democracy, in an effective democracy, the major political forces in the country are going to be represented. Okay, so she's got her second variable there is the politicians respond to their constituencies, right? So if the major political forces in the country are represented in these two parties, then the parties are going to have to do what's in the interest of their constituency. But if we look at democracy in Latin America, what we get is over and over again democracies that wind up not effectively representing large segments of the population. Ed. Jim, sorry.
I'm intrigued by the market regulator. One thing that reminds me of is actually, in a way, it's kind of Peter Evans' argument about embedded autonomy, in which he's arguing that what a state needs for development is at least certain agencies that are relatively autonomous from politics, from the government, as well as other important interests, but at the same time are embedded through social networks with the right kinds of groups. And I'm wondering if kind of an effective market regulator is somewhat similar. It has to be autonomous from the government, from politics essentially, but still through social networks tied into the national oil company and or the private oil companies, so that the kind of the communication channels are flowing. And then if you have an effective regulator, is that enough as long as you have political stability? You gave the example of Bolivia as a case in which you had a regulator that seemed to have the conditions to be effective, but it didn't work out because of the riots and so forth. If you have a good regulator, kind of by definition that means the energy policy is somewhat independent from politics. And so on top of that is what you really need? Is it just political stability? Is that enough once you've got the good regulator?
Well, I would argue that political stability, okay, is not going to be around for the medium term if you're not representing groups that in the contemporary era are empowered. And so the problem with Ghoni's scheme is it was politically stable for almost 10 years. Okay, the regulator existed, and the regulator was independent. But what that national development policy and the rents generated by the energy sector were going to were not satisfying the people at the bottom. So I would say, you know, they really weren't public goods being generated here, even though you had a regulator. All the regulator can say is, look, it would be inefficient to use your market power, okay, to raise the price to the consumers in this way. All right, so you can't do that. And it would be inefficient for the government not simply have a royalty and tax scheme on the National Oil Company, but actually have, in addition to that, a hand in to take stuff out of the National Oil Company. Now, what happens with those rents, the regulator doesn't say. So, you know, if the government is like Ghoni's government, right? They're taking those rents, they're appropriating them, but then they're appropriating them not in accordance with what large segments of society say they would like to do with those rents in favor of national development, but what Ghoni, sitting in La Paz, says should be done. And there's a clash there.
And the reason why the PRI was effective in 1980, you would argue, is it was inclusive?
I would argue two things. One is that, yes, the PRI was inclusive, but the reason why the PRI can be inclusive in 1980 and it can't be inclusive in 2000, even though it says, I want to be inclusive, is because people have been empowered in Mexico. You know, I don't have an explanation for the dynamics that lead social groups to become empowered. Not the area I work in. So I don't have an explanation for that. But what I do see is that it makes a difference. So in Mexico, you know, people feel represented by the PRI because the PRI has the worker section, the peasant section, and you know, and the PRI is delivering services. You know, over a long period of time, over 50 years, your village is going to get running water and electricity, and there'll be a school teacher. You know, so yes, there is progress there. But in the contemporary era, for reasons that I can't explain, because this isn't my area, all right? But in the contemporary era, people really feel empowered. And they don't want to be simply told, this is what you need, this is what we, the government, are saying you should do. Okay, people are saying, no, you know, this has to meet our needs as we define our needs. So the indigenous movements throughout Latin America have had a dramatic impact. Constitutions have been rewritten. This is an international group, so I mean, you know, we now have the UN. The International Labor Organization has this convention on the rights of indigenous people. That affects the energy sector, because in Latin America, lots of these energy fields, oil and gas, are in areas that happen to be populated by indigenous peoples. And as those indigenous peoples are demanding their rights and saying, this is my territory, it's not national territory, it's my territory, and governments are meeting that, the dynamics are changing. So, you know, I don't think that's a cop-out, that I can't explain why people are empowered. You know, I'll just take that as a given. This is why it allows me to talk about authoritarian governments as well. You know, when there's an authoritarian government, right, there's this competition within the government over what should we do. We're the government. We're appropriating these rents. What should we do? And the dynamics, I think, there are very similar to what happens in a democracy. It's just the groups that they're representing are broader based, and therefore what should come out of balanced competition should be, a broader based development in democracy than in an authoritarian government.
I'm sorry, I have a kind of stupid question because it's about your dependent variable. What exactly is your dependent variable? Is that national development? It seems that you argue, it's national development, but sometimes you use resources strategy or resources policy. You use these two concepts sometimes interchangeably. But I just want to ask, what is exactly your dependent variable and how do you plan to measure it? Because these two kind of concepts does not go always hand in hand.
Correct.
Certain policies that maximize the state rent does not have to go to the provision of social policy. The public goods. So how do you measure?
Yeah, no, I recognize that. My dependent variable is energy policy. All right, it's not national development. I'm assuming that national development is that given out there. The government defines its national development strategy. Okay, what I'm interested in is the explanation of what kind of energy policy a country has. All right, and the way I'm going to measure that is by the degree of intervention in the market. Okay, because that varies dramatically. Mexico's on one end where the national oil company has a monopoly on everything. They won't even let Petrobras come in. It's not a matter of private actors coming in or not. No, Petrobras can't come in. Pemex runs everything. All right. At the other extreme is, would be a country that has no oil, no national oil company, and it's just open to whatever actors come in, whether they're private actors or some other country's national oil company. And then you've got variations along there. All right. So I'm interested in explaining that variation there.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, you said your dependent variable is intervention by government, but why this kind of intervention by government has to be relied on the inclusion or competition of democracy? That is two of your major independent variable, right?
No, democracy is not the variable. The variable is the inclusiveness of the political system. Okay, so I would expect that an authoritarian government that has a balance among political forces that sustain that authoritarian government to be able to develop an energy policy that is more able to support its national development strategy than an authoritarian government where that power is not balanced, and therefore, even though it says, the authoritarian government says, this is my national development policy, it adopts an energy strategy that doesn't work in favor of that instead works in favor of appropriating those rents for the particular interests of the dominant group within the authoritarian government.
Okay. But just a final question: what's the relationship between the intervention and the national development you argue? Why you're seeming to argue the state intervention, the oil company or the oil field, the more national development they are creating?
No, I mean that was the point of my slide earlier.
Okay.
I'm not going to say that if a government intervenes in a market that's bad. Okay, and the best thing is for the government to be out of the market and only have a regulator. I think it depends on how a government intervenes in a market. I think it depends on how the private sector behaves in the market, and I think policy has a lot of influence on how the government intervenes. Policy is what the government does in the market. So. Yeah, I don't want to say that the degree of government intervention in the market determines whether the energy strategy. What I want to say is the way in which the government intervenes in the market, okay, has an impact on the ability of the energy sector to be able to support the national development strategy.
A follow-up question related to dependent variables. So, regarding the energy security strategy, when you first said that, I was thinking that you're going to talk about maybe taxes on consumption to promote efficiency, or looking for greater research, drill baby drill kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which would be one kind of energy security. But then you mentioned Venezuela, where they subsidize consumption. So the gas is 17 or 19 cents a gallon, which I guess is another kind of energy security. It's a security on the consumer level against exogenous shocks. So I was wondering, how, but you could also say, well, a tax on consumption that encourages diversification would also be an energy policy that is in favor of security. So I'm wondering, is that security kind of at the consumer level, or is it, or for the national economy? I mean, it seems like there would be a lot of different. If you could just elaborate on the concept, because it seems like there could be a lot of contradictory strategies that would fall under energy security, depending on whose security you're worrying about.
Right, right.
Or is it like any?
Yeah. I mean, this is again the question of a positive and normative. What I'm interested in is the government has said, okay, we want to provide energy security, and we're adopting these policies in order to provide that energy security. Okay, so I want to see how those, why those policies were adopted. I want to see how they work and don't work. I'm not an economist. I read lots of economics literature. They all disagree about what are the appropriate policies that one should adopt. And I learned a long time ago, I'm an old man, I learned a long time ago studying IPE that I couldn't decide what was the best policy. And I'm interested in explaining why certain things are done. So in the case of energy security, if the government is saying what energy security to us means is our consumers being able to buy gasoline at 17 cents, what I want to ask is, all right, you're defining it that way, and how does being able to provide gasoline to your consumers at 17 cents, how does that help support your national development strategy? And it turns out, in the case of Venezuela, that it actually undercuts your ability to do that. All right. But what you're doing is you're pursuing, Chavez, the Chavez government, is pursuing energy security in these terms. All right. Now, Chile is pursuing energy security by Chile is not a good example because in my argument, all right, Chile does not adopt an energy security policy. Chile adopts a market adjustment policy. Chile says, look, the price of natural gas is going to go up because we can't buy the gas from Argentina. Lots of people in Chile said, and we're talking about a democratic government, all right, a center-left democratic government. Lots of people in Chile said, my goodness, we can't pay these kinds of prices. You've got to find some way to subsidize this or that. And the government said, no, the economy is going to have to adjust to these higher prices, because adjusting to these higher prices is the only way in which we're going to be able to sustain this in the long term. So we are not looking to insulate our economy from those shocks. Our economy is going to have to adjust to those shocks. So energy security is policy to insulate your economy from those shocks. If the United States, when the prices went up and the federal government decided to dramatically draw down on the strategic reserves in order to drop gasoline prices from $4 to $2, okay? What you would have heard was how important it was for our economy in order to do this, et cetera, and that would have been an instance of a government actually adopting an energy security policy, okay? The policies are adopted in the short term and they're justified in the long term. Okay, I don't know of any of these policies where the government said, this only matters in the short term. The government says, look, we have a short-term problem that's important to solve for us to be able to develop in the long term, in the medium and the long term. So we need to do this now.
Almost out of time. Maybe one more question. Last one.
I'm also interested in conceptualization. I think because the way you work with your concept affects a lot of kind of the causal
Yeah.
logic of your stuff.
Mhm.
Could you go back to the graph? Because you have these two dimensions there, right? And I understand that the low-high market intervention, that's a relatively straightforward to define dependent variable. That's pretty, I mean, you can discuss, but that's pretty straightforward. But as I understand your causal stories, kind of what your three interacting independent variables really describe is movement much more on the y-axis than on the x-axis. And I'm a lot less clear what the variable ability of the energy sector to support national development strategy exactly entails. And I think that was the question earlier on too. And I'm also a little concerned that because that depends on the respective government's national development strategy, some governments are just going to have a lot harder time, right? If you're Evo Morales and your national development strategy says, okay, we're going to grow and we're going to be more equal and we're going to include indigenous people and we're going to do all these other fantastic things, you know, things are just a little harder than when you're Carlos Menem and you say, okay, we're going to liberalize and become a cool neoliberal country. It seems, I mean, exaggerating, but you get my point. The other conceptualization concern that I have is with the inclusiveness variable. I'm still not quite sure what exactly inclusiveness means. Does that mean that there's no group that's voicing, no large groups that voicing strongly that they don't feel included? For example, is Venezuela currently an inclusive political system because it includes the poor? But I mean, certainly, if you listen to the Venezuelan blogosphere, for example, it's a dictatorship and it's very much non-exclusive because Caracas elites certainly feel not included by the government. So is that an inclusive or non-inclusive government? And I'm worried that could be a little bit, you know, post hoc. Like if things go wrong, it wasn't inclusive.
Okay. A lot of good questions there. I'm going to have to go back. Let me work backwards, and then I'll ask you again for your first question, because I'm mixing them up. On inclusiveness, all right? What I mean is the ability of people to articulate their demands and be able to either attain power, okay, or you know, if this is your party, okay, for those demands to be part of that party, all right? So in the case of Venezuela, I mean, I would say it's still an inclusive political system because the elections are still held. It's true that, you know, Chavez has fiddled with some things here and there, but, you know, he lost that election in December of, what was it, 06. And he was forced to respect that loss. You know, so I would argue that it is an inclusive system. Okay, my argument doesn't depend on whether people say I was included or not. My argument is whether you're actually able to either achieve power or if you see yourself as you know, this is your.
How that is Mexico 1980 inclusive? And that I don't understand then, because I mean it's the pre, it's an oppressive, it's a weakly oppressive dictatorship, and lots of people don't get their concerns heard.
Okay, well that was my second thing of if this group says it represents you and you feel that it represents you, okay, then you're included in it. Right? Now Mexico in 1980, you know, who wasn't included in Mexico in 1980 in that political system? I would argue, okay, and I think this is the key to the PRI's longevity, is everybody but a handful of people felt included. Okay, the business sector was included, even though the PRI doesn't have a sector called, you know, the business sector. CNOP was not the business sector, but the business sector knows that the PRI is listening to it, that it has these informal accesses to power, and so therefore it has it is included when the PRI is thinking about what it should do. Okay, the peasants and the workers, even in 1980, okay, most of the peasants and the workers still felt that the PRI articulated their interests. Now we could find unions that didn't feel that, okay, and they got repressed. But unionized labor still continued to feel that. The reason why PRI loses the free election in 2000 is because it no longer represents all of these interests, and you know. This is why my inclusion variable, to I think go back to a point that one of you made, my inclusion variable is not the same as democracy. All right? So, you know, I agree, democracies are more inclusive than non-democracies, but non-democratic governments vary dramatically on who they include, the level of inclusion, and I think that's going to make a difference in the policy output of that government. So, you know, that's why I want to go in that direction. So I'll need a slide next time that says, you know, here's the definition of inclusion, and I guess I thought I had a slide on energy policy. Here's my definition of energy policy. Okay, so that was your third question. Your second question was?
No, I think that was the first, and the second question, or I thought was just the first question, was basically on this slide. So which of the two axes, to make it brief, is your dependent variable? Is it the x-axis or is it the y-axis?
Uh-huh.
What are you really trying to explain? Because I understand the definition, the conceptualization of the x-axis, and I'm not sure if I understand the definition of
I
the y-axis.
think what I'm trying to explain, I think what my dependent variable is the ability of the energy sector to support national development.
That's what I got from your talk, but that variable seems a lot more murky because that was my min-m versus Morales example. There might be a lot of variation in the national development strategy that might then kind of create a sort of endogeneity in the causal process. If you have kind of a very far-reaching, if you want, revolutionary development plan, it's going to do worse.
But I don't see. To me, the question isn't, is it harder to do it? To me, the question is, can you do it? I mean, if it's harder to do it and you can't do it, then you're just going to create a mess. So why even try it? All right? It's harder to do. You want to do it, so you want to do it right. I mean, you want to accomplish it. I mean, if you're Evo Morales, all right, and you want to change Bolivia, all right, if you think that changing Bolivia in this way is so tough, we're never going to be able to do it. It doesn't make sense to try and do it. You scale back your goal. Okay? But you think that if I can do certain things, I'm going to accomplish that. A little harder, but if I can do those things. So what I'm interested in is, okay, you want to achieve that. You're going to need an energy policy that works in order to achieve that. Now that's going to require not only the appropriation of rents, it's also going to require investment. It's also going to require being able to access markets. Okay, so how is Evo Morales going to balance this need to appropriate those rents and put them into incorporating people who have never been incorporated before, but yet keep producing gas that pays for it all? The problem is when Evo Morales can't keep producing the gas, or when he loses the markets and he can't sell the gas to anybody. Are the Bolivians going to eat the gas? You know, they can't do that. So what does that mean? It means that he's going to adopt an energy strategy that will ultimately mean that he's not going to be able to accomplish his national development strategy. Because it was hard? No, because his energy policy was not appropriate to what he wanted to accomplish.
On that note, we're normally triple overtime. So,
thank you.
Very much.
Oh, thank you.